So welcome to the virtual IAS, and welcome this afternoon to Competing Socialisms, which is a fascinating workshop and seminar that we have been really looking forward to hosting here at the IAS for some time, specifically because it challenges the notion that there is a binary in the Cold War and begins to ask some much more complicated questions about Sino-Soviet relations, and particularly with Africa. So we begin to think quite radically about the more horizontal histories, or indeed the more trans-hemispheric histories that we might be able to think about. So we are really looking forward to the two speakers today. When the IAS offers fellowships, one of the things we look for is both the idea that there are interesting relationships and collaborations that have begun to form between our LU colleagues and really interesting international scholars, but also that those collaborations have the potential to really think differently about the nature of the work that they are proposing. And this application to bring Kirsten Bönker to us from Torolf Klein, who are the two speakers today, was absolutely fascinating. And I have to say it was one of the ones that we looked forward to most, in the sense of meeting the expectations of what the IAS really can do, which is to foster genuinely international and interdisciplinary dialogue around areas that actually have incredible benefit for rethinking the nature of the traditions and the canons in areas of interest. So we are very, very delighted to be able to welcome today a wonderful fellow, and also a colleague who I would be ordinarily introducing in one way, but I'm very happy to say I am introducing, having just also had a promotion. So my colleague, reader in, is it Chinese, contemporary Chinese history? Or?
Yeah, but I'm still negotiating that. So
negotiating the title that, yes, but reader in Chinese and global histories, Torolf Klein. And it's Torolf who will chair today. So in a moment I'll turn over and he will do the introductions, but also effectively he will explain the nature of how we're going to run the forum today. So with that said, and congratulations offered, I turn over to you, Torolf, today. And thank you very much for everybody for being here.
yes, thank you very much, Marcia, for the kind introduction and the congratulations. I'm really grateful. I want to say a few words by way of an introduction, but I'll try not to keep it too long, so that we can really get to the substance of the matter. I've noticed that there are a few familiar names in the list of those of you who have joined us online, so it's really great to have you with us today, even if some of you probably already have an idea what we're talking about. But just very briefly, so this is part of a collaboration that Kirsten and I've been having for a couple of years now. We organized a workshop last year in Germany where we had a few more papers. And the basic idea of this is really look at the kind of triangular relation between the Soviet Union and China and Africa. And we are quite aware that Africa, of course, is very often a shorthand, a slightly lazy shorthand for a very complex and diverse continent with very different cultures, and also with very different political situations in the time that interests us, the Cold War. And so what we're presenting today really is a very minor, you might say, part of what we intend to do. And we have focused on one area in particular today, namely the media and the way that Africa, and when I say Africa, I think it's got to be put in imaginary quotation marks, how this was imagined by both Soviet and Chinese media, and so how images of Africa were related to the populations in the Soviet Union and China, but also what that meant and how that was connected to the broader kind of political economic processes and interests that both countries had in a continent that was in the process of being decolonized. So this is essentially what we're going to do. And our two papers will roughly take half an hour each. I propose that I will chair Kirsten's paper, and then conversely, you will chair the discussion for my paper, if that's okay. So we don't have this kind of double role of being the respondent and the person that runs the discussion. And I would also suggest that we try to maybe after your paper have a quick round of questions that see whether there are points for discussion, but maybe set a few minutes aside, 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so for a concluding discussion after we've heard both papers. But I think it would be important for people to have the opportunity to respond to what you are saying. So without much further ado, I will mute myself and I will hand over to you, Kirsten. And we are really glad you're here, you've made it, and that you know, we're really interested and keen on listening to you now on your paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marsha and Torov, and especially the International House here to invite me to LAFRO. It's really a pleasure to be here, although it was a bit difficult due to my COVID infection, which lasted until last week, but I'm glad to be here now. I will share my screen. And Toralf mentioned the conference we organized last year, or actually even 2 years ago, but we postponed it due to Corona. And this was the poster to advertise it, so competing socialisms and okay. And so to bring it somewhat up. So you see the competition that the artist tried to visualize, and I think he made a very good job. I actually was very happy with this poster, and we get impressions of how the Chinese side as well as the Soviet side tried to make their way to the top of Africa in more metaphorical view, but it's the old question who lastly made it, and perhaps we can try to give an answer at least a bit at the end of this workshop, or at least at the end of our hopefully of our project that will hopefully be successful in the end. So I changed a bit my title of the presentation. So I'm interested in the way Soviet mass media represented the Soviet engagement, so in its broadest sense of the word in Africa, related to the question, how did the Soviet media frame the imagination of being a world power during the Cold War? I would like to shed at least some light on the images the Soviet media conveyed to their audience about Africa, about African life, and about the Soviet engagement on the ground. I'm interested in the way the Soviet media shaped the popular discourse on Africa, and especially interested in the question how they framed the way the Soviet Union allegedly brought progress, development, and academic education to the African continent. To explore the Soviet engagement and the corresponding images of Africa, I will take a look at the othering of Africa and a popular travelogue that addressed children and their parents. I will try to relate this to the media coverage of African students, for one part living in the USSR, and to that of Soviet-African trade relations and the technical modernization the Soviet Union offered to African states. But this is only a very, very rough image, and very small and quick, and surely not very deep inside into the materials. So I hope to show that the media framed the popular discourse by conveying Soviet-African encounters and tracing a variety of convergence zones with African actors. I will argue that Soviet media aimed to give every newspaper reader and every TV viewer at least information regarding the broad Soviet engagement in Africa, but they often even painted a quite vivid image of these contacts and encounters. To explore the cultural exchange and encounters across the Iron Curtain and the North-South borderline, I draw on Susan Reed's considerations to explore these spheres of interconnectedness in terms of contact zones, sites of convergence, and sites of hybridization. And Susan Reed, she's quite well known, I suppose, here in Loughborough, refers to a concept that was originally placed in post-colonial studies on asymmetrical relations of power and encounters in colonial contexts. By emphasizing the implicit question of reciprocity, Susan Reed passed it on to a study of the mutual effects of close encounters, as for example, on exhibitions like the World Fair in Brussels in 1958. Drawing on this concept, I suggest that we can understand the encounters not only in their nonetheless highly important literal sense of the word, when people meet, but also in a somewhat more metaphorical understanding as a zone in which ideas, representations, norms, and values encounter as soon as it comes to the media coverage. If such self-representations of being a superpower relate to Africa, so as Tora said in quotation marks, Africa, as a general notion, which is not right to do it like this, but yeah, so Africa as an asymmetrical object of support and education, we can turn the bow back to the original idea of asymmetrical relations of power and the Soviet practices of othering in the context of the binary Cold War thinking. So I can, at this point, only examine the mutual processes through the prism of Soviet materials and not to the mutual materials from the African side. That's bad, I know, but I hope this will be better someday. So I start with an observation about how Africa was represented to the Soviet children and their parents. In 1983, Soviet party newspaper Pravda's Africa correspondent Leonid Pochivalov invited children and the parents with his richly illustrated travelogue, Tam Zamorium Africa, so that's there, beyond the sea is Africa, to accompany him on his journey through Africa. It's quotation. Here you can find everything, both beautiful palm groves and wide, impenetrable jungles, mountains, reaching for the sky with snow, never melting on the peaks, and sandy deserts, under the blazing sun where it never rains. Here you find big and noisy cities with skyscrapers similar to chains of hills and tiny hamlets with roofs made of palm leaves, spacious beaches on the shore of the ocean and vast high water rivers full of fish. In the endless savanna, elephants and lions, giraffes and hippos, monkeys and crocodiles. Nowhere else in the world do so many wild animals live in the wild as here. And how rich is the land? In there is like a fabulous pantry, everything that people need. Oil, iron, ore, gold, diamonds. Such is Africa, the hottest continent of our planet. End quotation. So in the early 80s, Pochivalov took up a long-established popular discourse on African life that was not specifically Soviet at all, but generally characterized the European and transatlantic attitude towards Africa. There were many other Soviet popular but also academic publications transmitting an exotic picture of Africa, full of ambivalences that were accessible to the Soviet public. This was due to Nikita Khrushchev's charm offensive that he launched against Western states on the one hand, and to his new strategies of cultural diplomacy towards the global south on the other. This broadened the scope for action below the highest state level, thus also changing the domestic interpretive framework for international relations, with African states by different measures of cultural diplomacy. The famous World Youth Festival in Moscow in 1957, the foundation of the Institute for African Studies or of the People's Friendship University in 1960, created convergence zones. We know well, so here are some students who studied at the so-called Lumumba University and met Lenin, at least in a virtual way. So we know very well about the engagement of the Soviet Union in the educational sphere. The Soviet Union aimed to educate the new cultural, technical, and intellectual elites by offering scholarships for students from the global south. This was reflected by a remarkable shift in publication content and strategies of journals then dedicated to the Middle East, to Africa, and to Asia during the late 1950s and the early 1960s. Between 1959 and 1961, the Academic Oriental Institute in Moscow published a new version of Problems of Orientalism, Problemi Vostokovedenia, jointly with the Institute of Chinese Studies, and in 1961, the journal, it looks very, very fascinating, the journal was renamed in Peoples of Asia and Africa. And it then adopted a strong focus on modern history, economy, and culture. This name change reflected the fact that the Academic Oriental Institute in Moscow was renamed Institute of the Peoples of Asia and one of Africa that was assigned to the new Institute for African Studies. I suppose that the new title of the journal was chosen because the traditional term Vostok, so that's East or Orient, did no longer match the new Soviet geopolitical ambitions. The regions required a precise geographical terminology to be conveyed to the public, to the Soviet public. The new title and its emphasis on people also refer to the ideological terminology used by various non-aligned and Afro-Asian solidarity organizations that were increasingly being courted by Soviet politicians from the late 1950s onwards. There was another important new publication of the Institute of Oriental Studies, namely the popular monthly journal Современный Восток, that is Contemporary East, which was renamed in Asia and Africa Sivonia, so that's Asia and Africa Today, in 1960. Unlike the yearly scholarly journal Soviet Orientalism and the more academic Peoples of Asia and Africa, this new publication that you see here claimed to meet a popular demand of the Soviet audience. It is still published until today. So these journals significantly framed the popular discourse on Africa, to which the correspondent of Pravda, Pochivalov, related with his travelogue. These publications had the common ground that they, on the one hand, revealed a European fascination for Africa's natural wealth, its wilderness, and eventually the otherness of the way of living, perhaps even of the people themselves. On the other hand, Pochivalov specifically contrasted this naturalness and wilderness in a typical way with technological, scientific, and economic progress to which the Soviet Union explicitly contributed. To give you just an impression, the invitation to the children that I read out to you to accompany him on his journey was illustrated by these photographs representing the ambivalent narratives about wilderness and progress with Soviet help. So the progress is on the image on the right side. Pochivalov designed a clear narrative of the Soviet superiority as an altruistic and engaged superpower that obviously did not irritate the Soviet audience. On the contrary, the Soviet-Russian audience was used to regard the periphery of their own country and all the more the global south as inferior and less civilized. During the thaw, literary, television, and film productions adapted this theme and revitalized it with the idea of a revolutionary elective affinity between the Soviet and the Black people. It legitimized that the superior Soviet people assisted the oppressed blacks in the anti-imperialist struggle. In this sense, the cinema audience and the TV viewers knew about this kind of Soviet engagement. Also, that's another impression from the travelogue. The director Andrei Spirsanov, famous African trilogy, presented politically conscious young black people who moved for the African struggle for freedom. Although it might not represent the typical Soviet film, I just show you some impressions from the first of this trilogy. It's called 1,000 Windows, Tisha Akon. So although it might not represent the typical Soviet film, it is interesting that it shows a realistic, partly documentary perspective on the question of how the Cold War and decolonization intertwined the lives of people in Africa and the Soviet Union. One film tells of the successful integration of Jules, a black man condemned to death in his home country, into his Moscow student community, the CIM. Another stages the last months of Patrice Lumumba, the first freely elected Congolese prime minister until his assassination. That's this film that's called The Black Sun. It is clear to the audience that the United Nations, the CIA, and Belgium, as the colonial power, were directly involved in this crime. The third film, The Chronicle of the Night, 1972, is the dramatic story of a plane hijacking. Terrorists seized the plane on which a Soviet doctor is flying to Africa for a treatment of the sick leader of a freedom movement. These films reflected the global commitment of the Soviet Union as the protecting power of the freedom fighters and as the host of the future elites of the young African states. The black protagonists became part of the Soviet self as they appeared as political fighters and legitimate heirs of their own the Soviet revolution. These films complemented the well-known and traditional picture Soviet media mostly presented about poor, homeless, and jobless blacks in Western societies and their depiction of the backwardness of African societies for which they blamed the colonial oppressors. The Russian African historian Lily Golden highlighted in her personal memories how these media images of African otherness had framed the expectations of Soviet people had before they really met any African people, and what could lead to certain irritations as seen on the Moscow Youth Festival in 1957. Although only a small group of Africans attended the Youth Festival, it at least a bit contributed to reshape the official images of the poor relatives exploited by Western imperialists. Lily Golden remembered that the African delegates were dressed too well to fit with official images of poor Africans. Having internalized such representations of asymmetric power relations, Soviet citizens had expected to see hungry people dressed in tatters. Instead, they had met affluent students who spoke several foreign languages, wore European dresses, and did not forget the culture, as Lily Golden depicted in her memoirs. The friendly encounters between normal people on such occasions like the World Youth Festival challenged the Soviet self-perception as a superior power and its claim to a global mission, to a global mission civilisatrice at an early stage. Despite the propaganda rhetoric of international friendship, Soviet girls should, of course, not fall in love and eventually have a baby with a black man. The contemporary representations of their otherness and backwardness outlawed such relations. These few remarks here shall outline the ambivalent frame in which the Soviet relations to Africa were tied to propaganda and included in the construction of the Soviet global self-representations. The correspondent Pochivalov's travelogue obviously related to this discursive frame defined by the well-known propaganda phrases and cliches like international friendship, the third world struggle against colonialism and imperialism. Soviet mainstream publications like the party newspaper Pravda and the satirical journal Crocodile underpinned them with a variety of caricatures about the evil capitalists suppressing the liberation movements in Africa. Pravda periodically reported about the travels to Africa of Soviet leaders or about African delegations coming to Moscow. So here are some posters from Crocodile, the left one Sputnik, so it's a satellite. 1958 redeems the oppressed Africans. That might be a relation you could not imagine before, but so many Soviet might have believed in that. Or on the right side, the Lord of his new life rises. It's time to end the bondage. His motto are two, that's in Russian, two fearsome words down with the colonial masters. Kolonizatorov Daloy, so that's the 2 words, in 1960. Or just another one, so the same narrative behind this kind of posters. In 1960, the year of Africa, the proclamation of independence of 17 states, and so a strong black man who destroys his chains with the ugly white dualist. So, I really like that. He carried Africa in his heart. So, and this was related to Lumumba, so the Congolese president who was assassinated by the CIA, by the Belgians. And this is what I mentioned, caricature from Pravda, a student from Africa with 2 little Soviet kids. We will learn together. Or this typical representation of how an African, in this case, Sékou Touré, the president of Guinea, arriving at Moscow in 1960. So in the middle is Nikita Khrushchev, who receives him and who lead him to his speech. His speech is on the 2nd page of Pravda. So the Soviet reader got a more or less detailed impression of these kinds of encounters on the political diplomatic stage. So, the Union of Soviet Friendship Societies, that was a quite important institution that were engaged in these encounters between African actors and Soviet actors. Also, not read Potivalov's travelogues, but also reported in their small journal about Potivalov's reports in Pravda, so that were published regularly in the daily coverage about Africa and also about his other publications. And this union was quite confident that Potivalov's narratives would also find its audience in the West, as the union initiated and paid for translations of Potivalov's travelogues to publish it in Portuguese and Spanish. And this is one of these examples of the translated books of Potivalov. Or this is another one. Moreover, Western libraries bought his Russian language publications. So not only the translated one, but also the Russian language publications were accessible in Western libraries during the Cold War. Thus, this kind of Soviet publications became part of the Cold War struggle of representations in the domestic as well as in the transnational public spheres. Potivalov's report is full of fascination and empathy for the hospitable African people he met during his visit. Typically, the author marked the Soviet perspective on Africa as generally European, thus challenging the Cold War binary of the politically divided Europe. It is very beautiful, our Europe, whereas the African soil is not like that in Europe. Pochivalov wrote in his travelogue. Regarding Africa, he depicted a simple life that was often characterized by poverty and the still existing strains of the deplorable former colonial exploitation. The good news, however, was that African people's life was undergoing changes and experiencing modernization. He considered the advent of modernity and modernization important to mention, but signs of modernizations were not the most notable aspects in Pochivalov's reports. However, he did not forget to mention Soviet contributions to modernizing the continent and for improving African people's life. He recounted them quite casually and related them to reports about the everyday life and concrete encounters with African people. Two appear to be especially impressive. In a small Nigerian village on their way to the Atlantic Ocean, Pochivalov, his companions and his travel guide met a group of people who were worried about a boy. The boy had been bitten by a snake, but there was no doctor around to save the boy's life. Hence, people asked the travel group to take the boy to a very good doctor in their car. They took the boy to the renowned doctor and the story had a happy ending. The doctor saved his life. Unexpectedly, it turned out that the doctor's name was Gennady Ivanovich Balakin, who originated from Voronezh. He was one of the several dozens of Soviet doctors the Soviet Union sent to Nigeria to fight with serious pandemics and improve people's life. Pochivalov lets the doctor depict the hard life in Nigeria, but also report about his good relations to grateful Nigerian people. Leaving the doctor and back on their way to the ocean, the travel group passed by huge oil pipelines. Oil is Nigeria's most important export good. We are happy about this today, I think. It perhaps did not come as a surprise to Pochivalov's readers that the Soviet Union helped Nigeria to build the pipelines. The author underlined that, I quote, "Here do not only work our doctors, but also engineers, technicians, workers. In Africa are quite a lot Soviet specialists. They help the Africans to build factories and mines. They teach at the universities as well as they teach to fly planes and to conduct ships. Therefore, wherever we have been in Africa, we have absolutely found friends who meet our homeland with respect." End quote. The encounter with the Soviet doctor was not the only impressive story about Soviet assistance to an African country. Pochivalov told his readers. Another one focused on a young woman called Elissa Baudou. She turned out to be one of the very few female engineers in Africa. Elissa was a forestry specialist who guided the travel group through the jungle. Apparently, surprisingly, she spoke fluent Russian. However, she had studied in the Soviet Union and had earned a Soviet engineering diploma. Thus, Pochivalov could report about a great success in educating the new African elite. As Elissa was a woman, her story also suggested that the Soviet Union assisted to social and political modernization in Africa. Apart from these success stories, Pochivalov especially addressed the children by linking his travelogue to one of the most famous Soviet children's stories, Dr. Aibulit. The children learned that they could meet every figure of Dr. Aibulit in the African savannah, but there would be no need to be afraid of them, although he looks like one need to be afraid of him. This was an elegant narrative strategy to paint a picture of convergence, as since the mid-1920s, any Soviet and up to date, any Russian child knows the evil pirate and man-eater Barmaley and the kind-hearted Dr. Aibulit. These tales paint a very ambivalent picture of Africa as a fascinating but dangerous continent from which Soviet Russian children should better stay away from. Quotation, "There are sharks in Africa, there are gorillas in Africa, there are big bad crocodiles in Africa that will bite, beat you and hurt you," end quote. But Africa is especially dangerous because it is home to an outlaw, a villain, and a man-eater called Barmaley, who's seen here. Thus, Pochivalov made clear that Soviet children could, at least in a metaphorical sense, travel to Africa. Nevertheless, Pochivalov's travelogue did not really show traces of convergence, as he as he presented himself and his traveling companions as guests who were interested in the African way of life. Thus, the encounters opened a contact zone based on African hospitality and Soviet friendship, but did not really create any similarities apart from the mutual interest. Finally, Pochivalov suggested his readers that his journey brought about new friends. Leaving the continent, he metaphorically waved goodbye. Hello to you, our new African friends. Hello to you, Africa. So to conclude, I would say that the Soviet self-representations of being a superpower reproduced long-established propaganda slogans like that of international friendship and the anti-imperialist struggle. They served to legitimate the Soviet regime as peace-loving and supporting the anti-imperialist liberation movements and all the post-colonial weak states. Thus, any Soviet involvement in the global South appeared as a major effort to peacefully compete with the aggressive USA, so like today. Against the backdrop of the Cold War competition and similar to Western practices, the practices of othering constituted an essential part of the Soviet self-representations. To stage itself as a peace-loving superpower that acted according to altruistic anti-imperialist values of international friendship had manifold functions and addressees. Soviet self-representations in mass media, popular and academic publications not only aimed to win followers in the global South, but equally aimed to reinforce political legitimacy on the home front as well as in Western countries. During the Khrushchev era, Soviet foreign policy was aimed to enhance the modernization of Black African countries due to Khrushchev's personal belief in the superiority of the Soviet model of agriculture, of economy, and generally of the Soviet society. Thus, he forced the Soviet ministries to sell Soviet agricultural machinery, etc., to the less developed countries in order to win the hearts and minds of the global South. The setbacks during the Congo crisis taught the Soviet leadership that the Soviet Union was not able to compete with the West using the same means, so that in accepting its limits, the level of Soviet resources invested in African issues decreased over the next few years. Although this gap between the self-representation, the mass media, and the, in the end, very unsuccessful strategies of helping the African countries to modernize were not represented in the Soviet mass media. So the Soviet audience only got to know about the successes of the assistant to modernize and to improve African life. So the gap was not represented. That would be my last sentences. Thank you for your attention.